about it. West Virginia is ready to provide that coal, and so are a lot of other states. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and quickly turn to a discussion about our nation's energy future. I thank the Chair and yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Quorum call on the floor of the Senate. We have heard remarks from some senators on the small business legislation that they've been debating this week. Deliberations on small business expected shortly, with debate and votes on 10 amendments to come. This bill would continue programs helping small high-tech and research startup companies. Live coverage of that debate when it begins here on C-SPAN 2. In the meantime, debate over a deal on the federal budget is continuing. A short time ago, we spoke with a reporter to get the latest.
Jim Rowley of Bloomberg News covering the fiscal year 2011 spending negotiations. Vice President Biden says negotiators have settled on a target of $33 billion in spending cuts for the rest of the fiscal year. House Speaker John Boehner said earlier today there is no deal, so where's the truth?
Well, Speaker Boehner didn't deny that there's discussions going on. In fact, he said we're talking. And Vice President Biden issued the same caution, almost the same formulation of words when he said that there's no deal until all the numbers.
Limitations on CO2, global warming gases, and the Environmental Protection Agency, that Congress has never made a decision on this. And the way it came out, in my view, is an example of judicial activism in a dangerous end run around popular sovereignty in America. 40 years ago, Congress passed a Clean Air Act. That act was designed to deal with particulates and mercury and NOx and SOx, things that had been determined to be pollutants. There was no thought at that time that carbon, CO2, was a warming gas that would create global warming. It was before the global warming discussion really ever was generated. Congress had no intention whatsoever to say that carbon dioxide, which is a plant food, which is not harmless to human beings and had never been classified as a pollutant, would be placed under the total control of the Environmental Protection Agency. But later, an activist Supreme Court, 5-4, seemed to say, but with not perfect clarity, seemed to say that because now we know, we think, some say that CO2 is a global warming gas that could cause global warming, the Environmental Protection Agency must regulate it, must regulate what really is a plant food and had never been considered to be a pollutant. And so I think Congress needs to act. I think Congress needs to assume responsibility. We need to say, no, we're not prepared to direct that the Environmental Protection Agency control all CO2 emissions in the country. We never intended that. We're not prepared to do that. If we want to start down that road, we in Congress will figure out how we should start down that road, how much ought to be done, but no group of bureaucrats should be empowered to regulate every farm, every apartment building, every schoolhouse, every automobile, every vehicle, every train, much less every electric generating plant in the country. So it's a big deal about reality and power in America. And it's just one more example of how judges and bureaucrats are utilizing powers really never intended to be given to them. Really, they sort of create to impose their agenda on the rest of the country. I believe we should back away from that, and that's why I support Senator Inhofe in his view. I thank the chair and would yield the floor. Madam President, I note the evidence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka?
Deliberations on small business expected. Deliberations on small business expected shortly on the Senate floor with debate and votes on 10 amendments. This bill, again, would continue programs helping small, high-tech, and research startup companies. Live coverage of that debate when it gets underway here on C-SPAN 2. Defense Secretary Robert Gates and Joint Chiefs Chair Admiral Mike Mullen making the rounds on Capitol Hill today. They're testifying for a second day about military action in Libya. This morning, they answered questions before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and this afternoon, it's the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Yesterday, the White House revealed it's engaging the CIA's help in supporting the opposition in Libya. You can see their testimony right now. Live coverage on our companion network, C-SPAN 3.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire is recognized.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I'm here, Madam President, to join my colleagues who have been down on the floor today with the leadership of Senator Boxer to oppose amendments that would undermine the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act has been one of the greatest public health success stories we've ever had in this country. In 1970, Republicans and Democrats came together to pass this landmark piece of legislation to address air pollution that was leading to countless deaths and lifetimes spent battling chronic illnesses such as asthma and emphysema. That legislation, back in 1970, was signed into law by President Richard Nixon. It's very clear that the threat of greenhouse gas emissions to public health is real. 2 years ago, the EPA found that man-made greenhouse gas emissions threaten the health and welfare of the American people. Their decision wasn't made in a vacuum, and despite what some of the supporters of these harmful amendments may claim, EPA's decision was based on the best peer-reviewed science. They were guided by the best science protecting the public health, not politics. The American Lung Association, the American Public Health Association, the Trust for America's Health, and the American Thoracic Society some of our nation's leading public health experts all oppose these misguided efforts to stop EPA from protecting our clean air. You know, we've heard the same story from polluters over and over again. Today they tell us that reducing carbon pollution through the EPA will wreck our economy. Back in 1970, and then again in 1990, they said the Clean Air Act would wreck our economy. Time and again we've heard the same arguments, and they've not been true. It sort of reminds me of Aesop's fable, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Since we passed the Clean Air Act in 1970, we have dramatically reduced emissions of dozens of pollutants. We've improved air quality, and we've improved the public health. The EPA estimates that last year alone, the Clean Air Act prevented 1.7 million asthma attacks, 130,000 heart attacks, and 86,000 emergency room visits. And this is particularly important to us in New Hampshire and in New England because we are effectively the tailpipe of this country. We have one of the highest rates of childhood asthma in New Hampshire in the country because we are still phasing out some of the coal-fired plants in the Midwest that are causing these air emissions. During the same period, since the Clean Air Act saved all of those illnesses and deaths last year, we've been able to grow our economy. Our gross domestic product has more than tripled, and average household income has grown more than 45%. So we know we can protect public health, we can save our environment, we can grow our economy. I recognize that as governor of New Hampshire when, back in 2001, we passed the first legislation in the country to deal with 4 pollutants because we understood that we needed to clean up our air and that we could do that and protect public health and keep a strong economy all at the same time. I wish that same can-do spirit and bipartisanship that led to the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970 and then later the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, I wish that same can-do spirit existed today to address carbon pollution. Because instead of debating amendments to undercut the Clean Air Act, we should be working together to enact common-sense legislation to reduce carbon pollution and to continue to grow our economy. I have no doubt that the American people have the ingenuity and the competitive spirit to solve our energy challenges. What they need from us in Washington is leadership. So I urge my colleagues to reject these amendments, to work together to craft energy policies that can help move us away from a carbon economy and transition to a clean energy economy. Thank you very much, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from New York is recognized.
Are we in quorum situation?
We are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be suspended.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I rise to speak about the current status of the ongoing bipartisan budget talks. Madam President, we are in a much better place than we were 2 weeks ago. The two sides are much closer than you might be able to tell from the public statements. After 3 months of back and forth, 2 short-term continuing resolution containing cuts, and 1 near collapse of the talks last week, we are finally headed for the home stretch. Last night, we had a very good meeting with the Vice President. Afterwards, he confirmed that the House Republicans and we in the Senate are, for the first time in these negotiations, working off the same number. As the Vice President said last night, there has been agreement to meet in the middle, around $33 billion in cuts. The appropriations committees on both sides are now rolling up their sleeves and getting to work to figure out how to best arrive at that number. Today, Speaker Boehner said, nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed to. That is a fair and reasonable position to take. He need not publicly confirm the $33 billion number, but as long as both sides keep their heads down and keep working, a deal is in sight. We are right on the doorstep. But, Madam President, there are outside forces that don't like this turn of events. Outside the Capitol today, there was a Tea Party rally staged to pressure Republican leaders not to budge off of H.R. 1. They want Speaker Boehner to abandon these talks and hold firm, even if that means a government shutdown on April 8th. This is a reckless and, yes, extreme position to take. Earlier today, the Republican leader came to the floor to defend the Tea Partiers rallying outside this building today. Let me say this. I agree with some of his points. For instance, I agree that the fact that the Tea Party is so actively participating in our democracy is a good thing. They have strongly held views and they join the debate. This is as American as it gets. But the Tea Party's priorities for our government are wrong. Their priorities are extreme because they're out of step with what most Americans want. Every poll shows that Americans want to cut spending, but with a smart, sharp scalpel, not a meat axe. They want to eliminate the fat, but not cut down into the bone. They want to focus on waste and abuse. They want to cut oil and gas subsidies. They want to end tax breaks for millionaires. They don't want to cut border security or port security funding that keeps us safe. They don't want to take a meat axe and cut vital education programs. They don't want to end cancer research that could produce research that saves many, many lives. And most of all, unlike the Tea Party, most Americans don't want the government to shut down. They want both sides to compromise. Madam President, a deal is at hand if Republicans in Congress will tune out the Tea Party voices that are shouting down any compromise. These Tea Party voices will only grow louder as we get closer to a deal. And our resolve must remain strong. If the Speaker will reject their calls for a shutdown, we can pass a bipartisan agreement. Many conservatives, whom I would otherwise disagree with, agree with me on at least this point. It was very interesting to see on Fox News yesterday 3 commentators, all on the same show, plainly agreeing that it is time to accept a compromise with Democrats to avert a shutdown. Charles Krauthammer was adamant that a shutdown would be avoided and that if the government did shut down, Republicans would be blamed. Kristen Powers, a conservative columnist, said, quote, what really should happen is if Boehner could strike a deal with the Blue Dogs and the moderate Dems and just go with the $30 billion with the Senate and just move on. unquote. And Bill Kristol agreed that while Republicans may like to pass a budget solely on their terms with only Republican votes, the reality is the Speaker would need Democrats to get a deal done. Mr. President, Madam President, the Tea Party may have helped the Republicans win the last election, but they're not helping the Republicans govern. The Tea Party is a negative force in these talks, but we are close to overcoming this force and cutting a deal. As the negotiations enter the home stretch, here's how we should define success. First and foremost, a government shutdown should be avoided. We should all agree on that. It bothers me when I hear some on the other side of the aisle or in the Tea Party say we should shut down the government to get what we want. Second, the top-line target for cuts should stay around the level described by the Vice President and that both parties are working off of. This makes complete sense, since $33 billion is the midpoint between the two sides, and it's what Republicans originally wanted in February before the Tea Party forced them to go higher. Third, the makeup of the cuts, as I suggested a few weeks ago, should not come only from domestic discretionary spending. You cannot solve our deficit problem by going after only 12% of the budget. Mandatory spending cuts must be part of the package, and the higher the package goes, the more the proportion should be tilted in favor of mandatory rather than discretionary spending. And fourth, the most extreme of the riders cannot be included. There are some riders we can probably agree on, but the EPA measure is not one of them. Neither is Planned Parenthood or the other extreme riders that have been so controversial. I believe we can settle on a few measures that both sides think are okay, but the most extreme ones do not belong in this budget bill. Those are issues that should probably be debated, but not as part of a budget and not holding the budget hostage to them. Madam President, if we can adhere to these tenets, we can have a deal that both sides can live with. Time is short, and we need to begin moving on to the pressing matter of the 2012 budget. And speaking of the 2012 budget, let me say a quick word about that. I saw today that House Republicans plan to unveil their blueprint next week. Interestingly, the report said Republicans no longer plan to cut Social Security benefits as part of that blueprint. They are admitting that it is not a major driver of our current deficits. That is true, and this is a positive development. It comes after many of us on the Democratic side, including Leader Reid and myself, have insisted that Social Security benefits not be cut as part of any deficit reduction plan. It is good to see that Republicans, including the House Budget Chairman, according to the reports in the paper, now agree with us. His original plan called for privatizing the program. I hope we are not going to bring up that again, because it will not pass. But if the House Republicans instead simply insist on balancing the budget on the backs of Medicare recipients instead of Social Security recipients, we will fight them tooth and nail over that, too. There has to be give on all sides, shared sacrifice, not just in any one little area. A lot is at stake in the current year's budget, but in another sense, it is simply a prelude to the larger discussions ahead. We urge the Speaker to resist the Tea Party rallies of today and the ones that are to come, to accept the offer on the table on this year's budget, and let us tackle the larger topics that still await us. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Madam President, with the